The deal that collapsed. What if I told you the United States and Canada were actually close to a trade deal just days ago, and then everything fell apart? On August 22nd, the United States imposed new 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian products, including goods such as wine, dairy products, cement, clothing, and hockey equipment. Canada immediately announced dollar-for-dollar retaliation starting September 8th. But the real story is not simply about tariffs. It is about what happened inside the final hours of negotiations. The proposed agreement would reportedly have reduced U.S. tariffs on Canadian cars and light trucks from 25% to 15%, and cut steel and aluminium tariffs from 50% to 25%. Then, the deal collapsed. Washington and Ottawa blame each other. The United States says Canada changed the terms. Prime Minister Mark Carney says Washington asked for too much and offered too little. The 1930 law. Now here is where this story gets unusual. The new U.S. tariffs were imposed under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law created almost a century ago. And according to U.S. and Canadian officials, this is the first time the United States has actually used Section 338 to impose tariffs. The law gives the president authority to impose additional duties of up to 50% when a foreign country is judged to be discriminating against American commerce. The Trump administration argues that Canada has unfair barriers involving areas such as dairy, alcohol, and automobiles. But there is another important detail. These tariffs are not simply a replacement for the normal USMCA system. Covered goods can face the additional Section 338 duty, even if they qualify under the North American Trade Agreement. That matters, because businesses built their supply chains around predictable trade rules. The car that crosses the border 7 times. Now forget the lawyers for a moment and look at a car. A modern North American vehicle is not simply made in Canada and then shipped into America. Its supply chain can move back and forth across the border multiple times. Canadian parliamentary testimony has described auto components crossing the border as many as 7 times before the final vehicle is completed. A part can be designed in one country, manufactured in another, processed somewhere else, assembled, shipped back for another stage, and only then become part of a finished vehicle. That system exists because Canada, the United States, and Mexico built one integrated manufacturing network over decades. And this is why Trump's January 1st, 2027 threat is potentially much more serious than the current Section 338 tariffs. Trump has threatened to raise tariffs on Canadian cars, trucks, and auto parts to 50%. What actually has the leverage? At first glance, America looks overwhelmingly stronger. The US economy is far larger, and Canada sends roughly 3/4 of its goods exports to the American market. So Washington clearly has enormous leverage. But Canada has a different kind of leverage, things America cannot easily replace overnight. Energy is the clearest example. Canada supplies around 99% of US natural gas imports and about 85% of US electricity imports. It is also the dominant source of US crude oil imports. And this creates a strange contradiction. Washington can put tariffs on Canadian products, but American industries are simultaneously dependent on Canadian energy, raw materials, and components. Prime Minister Carney has repeatedly pointed to this interdependence, arguing that the relationship is not simply Canada selling to America. Why Carney walked away? So why did Mark Carney walk away when a deal appeared to be within reach? This is where economics collided with sovereignty. Carney says the United States introduced new terms in the final stage of negotiations that Canada considered unacceptable. One issue involved Canada's ability to negotiate trade relationships with other countries. Another involved critical minerals. Reports said Washington wanted preferential access, while Carney made clear that Canada would not give any country exclusive control over its critical mineral exports. Then came the cultural issue. Carney said American demands touched Canadian protections for French language and culture, particularly in Quebec. For Ottawa, these were not ordinary tariff concessions. They were questions about what Canada could control inside its own borders. Carney's message was essentially this: Canada can negotiate tariffs, market access, and commercial rules, but it will not negotiate away sovereignty. September 8th. Canada hits back. The next major date is September 8th. That is when Canada's dollar-for-dollar retaliation is scheduled to begin. Ottawa says the countermeasures will target American exports, including steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. And Canada is being careful about how it uses this weapon. Retaliation can protect Canadian industries, but it also raises prices for Canadian consumers. Carney himself acknowledged that reality. So Canada's strategy is not risk-free. But there is another factor: political pressure. If Canadian businesses are being punished by American tariffs while Ottawa does nothing, the government looks weak. If Canada retaliates too aggressively, it risks making the economic damage worse. That is the trap. And Washington faces a similar problem. The United States can impose tariffs on Canadian goods, but American importers often pay the tariff first and then decide whether to pass the cost through to manufacture. The bigger threat is USMCA, but there is an even bigger issue hiding behind these tariffs: the future of USMCA, known as CUSMA in Canada. On July 1st, the United States declined to extend the agreement for another 16 years. That did not terminate USMCA. The agreement remains in force, but it has now entered an annual review process. In other words, the North American trade framework has moved from long-term certainty into a period of repeated negotiations and uncertainty. And that matters enormously for companies making billion-dollar investment decisions. Should an automaker build a new plant in Ontario? Should an American company expand a factory in Michigan that depends on Canadian parts? Should a Canadian energy company build a new export terminal? These decisions can take years to pay off. If companies cannot predict what tariffs will exist next year, investment becomes harder. That is why this trade war could leave a legacy, even if Trump and Carney eventually sign a deal. Two futures for North America. So where does this end? There are two very different possibilities. In the first, this becomes a structural fracture. Canada accelerates trade with Europe, India, ASEAN, and other markets, invests more heavily in domestic infrastructure, and tries to reduce its dependence on the United States. American companies, meanwhile, redesign supply chains to produce more inside the US. That sounds like independence, but rebuilding supply chains costs money, and consumers could ultimately pay for it through higher prices. The second possibility is an economic reality check. The auto industry starts warning about factory disruptions. Canadian exporters lose access to the American market. American manufacturers face higher input costs. Consumers see prices rise. And suddenly, both governments have an incentive to return to the negotiating table.